Have you ever felt completely, utterly, hopelessly stuck? We usually think about those huge personal crises in psychological terms, right? It's burnout, it's a breakdown, it's depression. But what if that's the wrong lens entirely? What if these moments are actually a structural, almost physical process, like your own personal operating system is undergoing a reboot that's governed by the laws of nature?
This feeling, this is the absolute core of it. It's a checkmate moment. It's that point where your old way of doing things, the you thought you were, just runs out of road. It can't calculate the next move. And it's not about you giving up, it's that the system itself has hit a dead end.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll talk about that crisis moment, the day the cockpit goes empty. Then, we're going to reframe that as an OS reboot, looking at the difference between the me and the I. From there, we'll look at just how fast this shift happens, dig into the actual physics that could be driving it, and finally, explore what it's even like to live in this new reality.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. That really strange, unnerving moment of total crisis, when your whole system just seems to grind to a halt.
This is what we're calling the checkmate moment. And it's often triggered by something very real, like a financial problem or a relationship ending. It's that point where your normal problem-solving self, the part that worries and plans and strategizes, has absolutely no moves left on the board. This isn't a moral failure, you guys. It's a functional shutdown. The program you are running is just outdated.
And what's so wild about this feeling is that it's not always panic and screaming. A lot of the time, it's this quiet, deeply weird calm. It's the sense that the pilot, the driver you always assumed was flying the plane, has just vanished. Poof. Gone from the cockpit, but the plane is still flying.
And that brings us to a really powerful way of looking at this whole experience. What if that breakdown wasn't a breakdown at all? What if it was a necessary system update? A fundamental reboot from one internal operating system to a completely different one.
So inside of us, we've basically got two different modes of operation. There's what we can call the me OS. That's the ego, right? It runs on past experiences, on fear, and on this relentless need to try and control what happens next. But then there's the I OS. This is your deeper self. It runs on flow, on intuition, and in this mode, the me doesn't just disappear. It gets a new job. It becomes the user interface for this much deeper intelligence.
And this table really lays out the differences. Look at the data source. Me OS is always looking at the past, what happened before, what you're afraid of. iOS is pulling from what feels like a future log, this sense of what's unfolding. The primary goal? Me OS wants to control and survive. iOS just wants to receive and observe. So your role changes from being the stressed out driver to just being the interface. And fear? This is a big one. In Me OS, fear is a command. Do something now. In iOS, fear is just information on the screen. It's a notification, not an order. So how does this shift actually play out? Well, from what we can tell, it's not some slow, gradual process of self-improvement. No, it's sudden. It's a sharp, rapid transition, like a phase inversion, where your personal timeline just snaps onto a totally new branch.
Just look at this timeline. The whole thing happens incredibly fast. For a few days, it's like the iOS is laying down new tracks behind the scenes, getting things ready. Then the me OS has its last big freakout, trying desperately to control everything. Then, bam, the checkmate moment. An external event happens that makes it impossible to deny the game is over. And almost immediately, within days, the new OS is up and running. The old anxieties might pop up, but they've lost their power over the system.
Okay, this all leads to a really important question. Why does this feel so involuntary? Why does it feel like something that happens to you rather than something you choose? Well, this is where we get into the actual physics of the shift. There's a reason it feels less like a decision and more like a law of nature just doing its thing.
So we've got two big questions on the table. First, why can't you just go back to the old way? Why is it irreversible? And second, why does it seem to need this intense crisis-level pressure to even happen? Why can't you just meditate your way into this new state?
The answer, believe it or not, comes from physics. It's a concept called spontaneous symmetry breaking. Now stay with me here. Imagine balancing a pencil perfectly on its sharp tip. That's a symmetrical state, right? But it's also super unstable. The tiniest breeze, and it's going to fall. And when it falls, it has to choose a random direction to fall in. It lands flat on the table in a new, much more stable state. The original perfect symmetry is broken, and there's no way it's going to stand back up on its tip by itself. So let's apply that to us. The Mios is that pencil balanced on its tip, using a ton of energy to keep everything perfectly under control. The crisis, the checkmate, that's the critical point. That's the little push that makes the whole balancing act impossible to sustain. So what happens? The system has to fall. It spontaneously drops into a new, more stable, and way more energy-efficient state, the IOs. The old reality, the old symmetry, is permanently broken.
And this is why it feels like it's out of your hands. Because on a structural level, it is. It isn't a choice you're making, it's a phase transition the system is undergoing. It's just like water turning to ice when it hits 0 degrees Celsius. The water doesn't decide to become ice. Once the conditions are right, it just becomes ice. It's a physical inevitability.
So what's it actually like, to live in this new OS? What happens every day when that driver's seat is empty and you're just along for the ride?
Well, life just feels fundamentally different. There's this sense of being moved, or even lived through, instead of you doing the moving. Fear still shows up, sure, but it's lost its authority. It's data, not a directive. Your old personality, the me, starts to feel like an avatar you're just watching. Things get done, decisions are made, but that feeling of an internal decider is just gone. And all those weird synchronicities, they stop seeming magical and start looking like the system just elegantly and efficiently closing the gap between right now and a future that's already on its way.
Here's a really practical example. Think about having to do a task you don't love. In the old me operating system, your thinking is, ugh, I have to do this or something bad will happen. It's an action driven by fear of the future. In the new iOS, the thought is more like, okay, the task of handling this has now appeared in my awareness. It's just a thing on the screen for this moment. You're just processing a UI element. The fear is gone.
Honestly, this might be the best way to sum up the whole thing. You haven't abandoned the car. You're still on the journey. You've just changed seats. You're no longer frantically gripping the steering wheel, trying to navigate. You're just watching the scenery go by from the passenger seat, trusting the ride.
And that lands us at this beautiful paradox that sits at the very heart of this new state. It feels like absolutely no one is in control, but at the same time, there's this deep, quiet trust that the destination is already set and the path is just unfolding exactly as it should. It's an incredible release.
So, I'll leave you with this to really think about. We put so much pressure on ourselves, right? To make the right choices, to steer our lives perfectly. But what if the biggest, most pivotal moments of change in our lives aren't decisions at all? What if they're just physical phase transitions we undergo, as natural and as inevitable as water freezing into ice?